The subject today is modern slavery. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and give respect to the elders past and present. I also give respect to the elders from my own tribe, and they were people who 200 years ago were working to stop slavery as it then existed. It was understood to exist because Africans were being transported across the Atlantic to work on plantations in the Americas. Now, today we're going to cover the forms of slavery that did not stop 200 years ago, and we describe those forms of slavery in this book, which is called Australians and Modern Slavery. So there's a call to action. I want you to buy the book, I want you to read it, and then I want you to pass it on to your local school, your local Member of Parliament, your local council, your local library, and in that way you become a human rights worker as well. Now today we're going to cover what slavery is, what forms slavery can take, systems of slavery and the engines that drive them, how Australians encounter slavery, why the book is essential reading, and what we Australians can do and how we can respond. So let me start with what slavery is and how we define it. Slavery exists when one person owns another person. Slavery is not an accident, it happens because someone can make a profit. Now we can think of slavery in a simple way. There's lots of violence, abuse and exploitation in the world, and we've got laws to deal with that, laws to do with assault or unfair work practices or kidnapping. Slavery is different from these everyday crimes. Slavery happens when a person acts like he or she owns another. And there is a change of state from free to unfree. Now, if I steal your labour, that's a crime against you, your person. But making you a slave is a crime against all humanity. Now, being owned also means we need to think about how people can escape from slavery, what pathways they can take. Sometimes when I speak on slavery, I carry two sets of chains with me. One set of chains is for people who were born into slavery. Someone who's born into slavery might actually fear being liberated because they wonder where the next meal is coming from. Who's going to feed my children tonight? So the challenge if you've been born into slavery is to learn how to live like a free people. And the writers on the subjects of power and empowerment are the ones that come into play. On the other hand, if I'm captured, taken into slavery, having been born free, my path to the recovery is likely to be dealing with the trauma, the shock of the loss of freedom, the trauma that I've experienced from the violence and abuse that's kept me trapped. And the theorists in that regard are Lindemann, Lifton, Kaplan, and the other people who deal with, or help us to deal with, trauma. Now, Slavery Links talks to government because all funds currently are going to people who are captured. None of the funds are going to people who've been trapped by persistent systems of slavery that still exist in the world. And that funding gap needs to be closed. The book Australians and Modern Slavery sets out how programs could address these slave-making systems with community-based responses. Community-based. We can develop community responses in Australia as in the region. Now, my second topic, what forms can slavery take? The United Nations identifies 11 forms of slavery, and this helps us understand that slavery can appear in obscure or unfamiliar ways. Some people are born into slavery, even today. Child labour, child soldiers, child trading, debt bondage or debt slavery, forced labour, forced marriage, forcing in war, human trafficking, labour trafficking, organ trafficking. These different forms all express the same underlying condition where one person is trying to exercise ownership over another. So the book pulls together all the useful threads of work about each form of slavery. And the book also explains why, if you go online and Google, you can come up with quite different estimates of the numbers of slaves in the world today, because the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, the United States of America, all count slavery in different ways. Now, we run with the United Nations definitions because they have the highest international standing. And we use a figure of 27 million slaves in the world today, and that figure comes from an American researcher and campaigner called Kevin Bales. That figure of 27 million includes some very large groups and some smaller groups. There are millions of debt-bonded labourers, mainly in South Asia, and the best estimate available is that there are somewhere between 18 million and 22 million people trapped by debt bondage, mainly in South Asia. There are thought to be about 300,000 child soldiers at any one time. There are figures ranging above 100 million for the number of children working in our region. But not all those children are slaves, because while they're missing school, they're being exploited, some of them might be being mistreated, they are not owned. Now, systems of slavery and the engines that drive them. Some of the forms of slavery I mentioned are systems that trap whole groups or classes of people. Debt bondage, which I've mentioned, is a system that traps men, women, children, whole families. So does serfdom. Forced marriage is upheld by another system that regards women as property. Child trading is a system that traps children and their parents. We don't know how many children are traded. We don't know how many women are forced to marry. And we don't know how many serfs there are. No one's counting and measuring those systems, and that's another one of the things that needs to change, the very basic research of what's happening to whom where. Now, once we recognise these systems are ongoing, we can ask, what enables a system to persist? And where does the energy come from? And how does the slave-making engine work? If you Google causes of slavery, has anyone tried to do that, Googling slavery? You'll come up with the answer or the claim that slavery is caused by poverty. And we think it's a bit more complicated than that. In Australians and modern slavery, we identify 4 engines that drive slave-making systems: poverty, and powerlessness, and crime, corruption, and conflict. 4 engines that drive slave-making systems. And we argue that all 4 need to be dealt with if an anti-slavery program is going to be effective. So let me illustrate that with an example from a movie. How many of you saw Slumdog Millionaire, the movie? About, more than half, 60, 70%. So that was about poverty, not slavery, but it gives a useful illustration. If you're living in that slum in Mumbai and I come along and offer your family a fridge or a television, I've helped you take a baby step towards doing something about the poverty that you experience. But I haven't dealt with power, and the family still lacks power to deal with authorities. So they can't get their kids into school, or they can't get safe water to drink, or they can't get land tenure. Powerlessness, the second engine of slavery. I give you a fridge and the family is still subject to the demands of the slumlords that you saw portrayed in the film. Now, the crime can only continue because corruption allows it. So crime and corruption go together as the third engine of slavery. The family can't get a fair hearing if they complain because courts and decision-making tribunals have been compromised. There's conflict. The fourth engine of slavery. All 4 engines need to be dealt with if we're going to deal effectively with slave-making systems. Now, how do Australians encounter slavery? We think Australians encounter slavery in three ways. Firstly, within Australia, there are criminal scams, and we hear about trafficking and other scams in the newspapers and media. Cultural practices and forced marriage is one of those that gets media attention from time to time. There's past experience. Humanitarian entrants who've come to this country may have experienced forced labour on their way here. There are families who live near Melbourne that I meet who've lost children to child soldiering. For them, that's a very real experience. Now, secondly, Australians encounter slavery when we travel overseas. Australians need to be educated and informed so we don't add to the problem. Thirdly, when we do business or consume, we can contribute inadvertently to slave-making processes. Now, why the book's essential reading? I just want to touch on 4 reasons why we think the book is essential for Australian audiences. 200 years ago, slaves were chattels. That means being treated like a movable piece of furniture. Eventually, from 1807, the slave trade was outlawed, and then in 1833, the institution of slavery itself was outlawed, but only in British territory. Now, Australia was being settled in that window from 1807 to 1833. And Bruce Pascoe wrote a book that sets out the ways in which Australian authorities were concerned that our treatment of the Aborigines might come to the attention of these anti-slavery campaigners in London, and that might affect the way we were settling the country at that time. So our intersection, our connection to the slavery changes were different in Australia from what happened in the United States and Britain. The second reason the book's essential for Australian audiences is the culture of euphemism, or let's pretend. After 1833, the institution of slavery was banned. Slaves were freed in a formal and legal sense, but inventive businessmen found a way around that. In the West Indies, slaves were placed into what was called an apprenticeship system, but it was as brutal as anything that had happened under slavery previously. In the Pacific, there was a different process. A system of indentured labour was used to develop the plantations in Queensland, and in what's now Indonesia by the Dutch, and in French Polynesia by the French. So in the year 2000, that is 12 years ago, there was a bipartisan apology in the Queensland Parliament to what are now called the Australian South Sea Islander peoples. There's still a population of those peoples around Mackay in Queensland, and a process of restoration has begun. Third reason why we think the book is essential is Australia's place in the region. In our region, people get trapped by systems of slavery, and these systems are not new, they've persisted for generations. The systems trap whole groups or classes of people, and Slavery Links offers workshops where we consider how that happens. You can sign up at the back at the end if you wish, or at least express your interest. Now, in 1956, Australia signed a treaty called a Supplementary Convention, signed a treaty which identified 4 of these slave-making systems. They are debt bondage, child trading, forced marriage, and serfdom or peonage. People trapped in these systems are also more vulnerable to the other forms of slavery, that is forced labour, child soldiery, human trafficking and so on. The fourth reason why we think the book is essential is because it talks about community-based responses to slavery. There are lessons we can learn from South Asia about people making change in community. Now, why work in community? Because individual case finding, targeting perpetrators and victims, individual case finding won't change the slave-making system. The book considers how to involve communities in anti-slavery work, and government, in our view, needs to do program development that involves community in a way that's relevant to making change at system level. That's not a replacement for policing. It's a complement and a supplement, and a necessary one. Now, what can Australians do? We can learn more, we can urge government to act, and we can start to act ourselves. Learning more, there's the workshops I mentioned to sign up to. Urging government to act, we need proper programs to address systems of slavery, as I said, using criminal law and community-based programs. Thirdly, we can start to act ourselves. You can become a member, join Slavery Links and contribute in some way. You can sign up for the workshop, you can buy the book. There are action lists in the book that you can follow. And fair trade is a start that every person in Australia can make. Who's been to Britain recently? Okay. Fair trade is in your face anywhere you go. Tesco's, Sainsbury's, that notion that by paying a little bit more we can assure justice back through the supply chain. Now, fair trade systems aren't perfect, but they do offer protection to people who are otherwise vulnerable. So today we've covered what is slavery, and slavery is ownership. I've listed the forms that slavery can take. We've identified systems of slavery and the engines, that is poverty, powerlessness, crime, corruption, and conflict. All of them together. We've talked about how Australians encounter slavery and my view on why this book is essential reading for Australians.